Welcome to Judge for Yourself. A recent article criticizing the established media really perked our interest. Why? Because on this show, constitutional issues are of paramount importance. Freedom of expression is central to the Constitution. The diversity of media is therefore central to this whole particular enterprise. And the article was suggesting that in fact our media are biased, that they present a particular perspective, if you wish, a westernized perspective of the world, and they ignore other perspectives. And that really prompted the idea that we should have a program in which we ask the question, well, are we being properly served in our democratic state by the media we have? And if not, why not? Joining us today, Roscoe Palm, co-founder of the Pan-African Institute for Socialism, and Anton Harber, adjunct professor of journalism. Let me ask you the following. As I prefaced in my introduction, you've written this piece together with Philip Dexter, which is hugely critical of almost all the media in South Africa. I mean, what is the evidence that you have for that?
Well, I have to thank you for having me here to discuss this.
You may not thank me by the end of all of this, but nonetheless, carry on.
No, I still will. Thank you.
Yeah.
To discuss this very important issue. As you say, myself and the co-founder of the Pan-African Institute for Socialism, Dr. Philip Dexter, penned an article as a response to the attack that we had faced by what we can only call a hit piece by amaBhungane. Now, this piece published in amaBhungane, written by Mika Reddy and Sam Soul, was ostensibly about the closure of New Frame, a left-leaning publication. But it was quite clear that it quickly became a platform to attack enemies of liberal media in general, and in particular enemies of some of those writers. So all of those things that were written in something that claimed to be an investigative piece had no basis in reality.
I understand that. I understand
Yes.
the fact that you're frustrated about that, and quite frankly, if I could buy you and Sam Soul a cup of tea that you could sort out your problems, I'd be happy to do so. I'm much more interested in what you went on to say, which is really the centerpiece of this program, which is the extent to which you are suggesting that all of this media, very significant in terms of their readership, media, which most of us get from our computers today, are biased and slanted almost to the extent of that CIA inspired. Sort of reminded me almost of McCarthyism here of the left. I mean, is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think that when we went away and did our research as to what the possible agenda could be for this hit piece, which attacked us, it attacked NUMSA, it attacked many organizations baselessly, we found some very interesting research that all of this so-called independent media outlets were feeding from the same funding trough. There were these magical staircases that led from the boardrooms and the top structures of these publications straight to these US State Department aligned institutions.
But let's leave it, we could come back to the funding for a moment. What I'm much more interested in, are you saying that the content which people listening to this particular program are reading essentially are skewed in favor of a particular view which would be retrogressive in your view?
Absolutely.
And what is your evidence when I read the stuff that they write, which is so objectionable?
Well, the culture of newsrooms don't need to be policed by any sort of authority. Journalists find a way to fit into the culture to prevent their stories to get spiked. Now, we're not saying that there's anything particularly wrong about taking funding from the National Endowment for Democracy or any of these front organizations that support the US State Department. What we're saying is that this must be declared.
I understand that, but I'm far less interested in the funding. I'm sorry for pestering you, because what I'm interested in, and I mean, it's not that there's not a program on that, there is. But I suppose my objective this evening is to ask, are we therefore, as readers, not getting a relatively comprehensive kaleidoscope of the news? Are you suggesting that these publications skew the news in favor of a particular perspective? And if so, what is that perspective?
Well, I disagree that funding doesn't matter.
I'm not suggesting funding doesn't matter, but I'm going to the end product for the moment.
I'm saying that there's a vertically integrated program that we've seen among the liberal media to create, to only allow one particular worldview. That's a Western imperial worldview. And that is undeclared, Judge.
Well, okay, now I understand that. And so, Professor Harber, I mean, you've been, firstly, you've been a distinguished editor in your career and a professor of journalism. How do you respond to the critique that, in fact, so much of our media, as being suggested here, really is skewed because of its funding in relation to a Western imperialist agenda? I'm using the words of my panelist.
You know, our media has its faults, Dennis, and it does have its biases. But what I'm hearing is a gross generalization and gross exaggeration of the situation. I have read carefully the article that made these accusations against these publications and websites. And it's hugely ironic to me that they take on some of the country's best investigative journalists who wrote a very detailed and evidence-backed piece about various links behind the publication they were writing about, New Frame, which closed recently. And in fact, when you read the evidence on which these accusations are based in attacking amaBhungane, it's riddled with inaccuracies, distortions, exaggerations, half-truths, and even blatant untruths. And I'll give you an example or two,
please,
if you wish.
Because I'd like Roscoe to respond. Carry on.
Well, for example, we've just heard an accusation that they're funded by National Endowment for Democracy and State Department sources, even if it's through fronts. Now, these publications, it's absolutely known, open, published on their websites who funds them. So there's no secret. And there's a number of organizations there. I don't think any of them you could call them fronts for the US State Department or anything like that. Some of them have funded some stuff that's enormously critical of the State Department, for example. So, but they're open about it. It's no secret. The accusations, a lot is made in the piece about the allegation that they were flown to Cape Town. The editors are flown to Cape Town for a monthly meeting where they wined and dined, and they travel apparently first class, courtesy of the US ambassador, to be briefed on what they must say and write and what the talking points are. Now, a simple check, you know, I spoke today to the editor of Daily Maverick, the editor of amaBhungane, and the editor of News 24, and there is just no truth in it. It just didn't happen. So there wasn't a basic attempt to verify the facts.
I understand that.
And you ask anyway, is that editors attend briefings all the time.
I appreciate that. Can I ask
you this?
Can I ask you this? Because I'm very anxious about talking about content. How do you respond to the accusation that these media are portraying a particular Weltanschauung worldview, which is one particular one, which means South African readers don't get a broader view of the world? I mean, there's suggestions, for example, in the article that, as I understand it, and I can be corrected by Roscoe if I'm wrong, you know, that essentially there's an anti-Chinese bias, and there's a pro-Ukraine bias, etc., etc. Now, how true is that when I read the news, which are produced by all of these publications?
Well, I think it's a gross simplification and a gross exaggeration. Yes, these publications have their views and their biases. amaBhungane is a strange one to attack because it's purely an investigative unit. So mostly it's investigating state corruption, corporate corruption, private sector corruption. And it's very hard to see a consistent political agenda except one critical of current levels of corruption, for example. But it doesn't. It seems to me a gross oversimplification to just say it's a kind of pro-Western bias.
Okay, let me put this to you. So how do you respond to the fact that it's been suggested that there's significant inaccuracies in your claims?
Well,
what am I supposed to do if, just listening, if all of the editors say this never happened? And if you don't have any concrete proof that it did happen, then should you have made the accusation?
I'm really glad that earlier Sam Soul has come out and said that he hasn't, in fact, attended this on the rocks, off the records briefing, and that he said that he attended a briefing by the French government. So now that we know that if amaBhungane reports on anything to do with Francophone Africa, he's at least declared, he's at least...
But surely, can I ask you this? Surely it's the role of journalists to attend briefings from whoever. Doesn't show that they committed to that particular perspective.
I asked Professor Harber to read the initial hit piece that was published in amaBhungane with the same eye that he's read the piece that we responded with.
I'm asking you bluntly, if these claims are inaccurate, are you prepared to retract them?
Well, we would ask the same question of amaBhungane, because there was no basis, in fact, in their hit piece. So what we're saying is that these things are allowed to stand.
Have you disclosed your funding?
We have. We, in fact, are not funded. We're a self-startup
by nobody.
Well, we certainly aren't funded by the Chinese Communist Party, whatever fabulous notions that Mika Reddy and Sam Soul had to say, that's for sure.
I've got a series of further questions to ask you, but let's take a break and we'll come to those. Welcome back. You see, I'll tell you what I suspect, Roscoe, people watching this are going to say, apropos amaBhungane, and maybe more, that a lot of these publications expose state capture, egregious forms of state capture, now confirmed by the Zondo Commission. By attacking them, it almost appears as if you're sympathetic to the capturers.
Not at all, and I'm glad that you brought this up.
Yes, I want to know your view.
There's been a program on Twitter and in online spaces to tar us with the same brush, because of late there have been people who have used the issues that we bring up to slipstream their particular political agendas and, frankly, their agendas to stay out of jail on this issue of the independent media being captured by liberal forces. But I will say this, Judge, that this is an unintended but not entirely unpredictable consequence of the ripple effect of the stone that was cast by amaBhungane in basically attacking us and NUMSA and all these other organizations. The blowback has been that they have empowered bad actors, guys like Iqbal Survey, I will name them, Iqbal Survey, Carl Nias, and all of these guys who seek to break down constitutionalism and the rule of law in this country.
They would support your argument.
Absolutely not. We do not support them.
No, hang on. They would support your argument that the press are biased. And that would essentially be very damning to the idea of a press that can hold a government accountable, surely. Surely you're in favor of press holding government accountable. Surely you'd be
absolutely
applaud the idea that we found out 100%. A lot about states of capture from all of these organizations.
Yes, we 100% support that.
Okay, so
and
then
we say,
so your gripe is, you've got one gripe effectively, and I'm not saying it's not a serious one. You know, we can debate that, which is that you are cross because amaBhungane essentially have, in your view, from your perspective, defamed you.
Judge, they took the reputation of a sterling magazine publication, amaBhungane, and they used that to publish a hit piece with no evidence whatsoever.
Well, Professor Harber suggests there's a lot of evidence.
Well, I would suggest that he reads the hit piece put up by Mika Reddy and Sam Soul.
I suspect he might have, but let me ask you one question before I put that to him.
Well, perhaps I could come in here.
Yes, you could, with pleasure.
I have read the piece very carefully.
I thought you would. Yeah.
I have read the piece very carefully.
And
what I will point to is the fact that you haven't challenged one fact in it. You haven't given any substantial challenge to the facts. It appeared, as I read it, to be a very thoroughly researched piece, and they have a reputation for very thorough, reliable work.
Then we have different
Now
standards
you're
of thorough
smearing them and
research,
calling them
Professor, to
names,
be
but I
honest
haven't
with
heard
you.
you challenge one
Well,
fact.
what facts have you challenged? That's what's being asked of you.
Well, the initial contention by inference was that we are agents of the Chinese Communist Party receiving funds to
But that wasn't the
redirect
only-
funding
that
from...
wasn't the
that
only
was
basis.
absolutely the
But that
inference.
wasn't the only basis about their report, was it? There were facts in that report.
Like what?
Well, there were facts about funding, were there not? Have you challenged any of those?
Absolutely.
But
We-
where
we've
do I
we've-
read them?
we've
Not
come
in the
up-
piece that I read in the Daily Maverick. There may be another piece, in which case I'm sorry if I haven't read it, but not the one that prompted me to invite you in here.
So they've constructed a fabulism based on the fact that a publication spent 122 million in 4 years and then went broke. There's no big conspiracy theory involved in that.
Where did the 122 million come from?
Well, the 122 million obviously came from a funder.
Mm-hmm.
And my understanding is that that the funder then decided, as is their right,
And who
to
was
pull
the
out.
funder?
Well, the funder, I can't speak for New Frame because I'm not a member of New Frame. This entire thing was concocted
see,
because
that's the
we
problem.
were speaking
Yeah,
to
okay.
allies across the board as the Pan-African Institute for Socialism. And then all of a sudden, this thing was concocted out of whole cloth.
So, Anton, I mean, what's being suggested is that the claim that the funding comes from these nefarious sources is unsubstantiated.
Well, not in the piece I read, but you know, it's wrong to call it a hit piece, I would say. But what they did was they looked closely with their interest raised by the fact that New Frame could get such an extraordinary amount of money
120
and
million,
burn
yes.
up in such an extraordinary amount of money. Yes, and have very little impact with it. They looked into where does this money come from and who else gets this kind of funding. And what they did was show a network that appears to be linked to one particular funder who lives in Beijing, it seems, and has close ties to the Chinese ruling party and has created
That's a lie.
this
Absolutely.
funding
That's what
network.
they say. How do you know it's not
That's
in
true?
what
South
they
Africa.
say,
Now,
exactly.
if it's
How do you know it's
untrue,
not true?
So there've been all of the when
So,
you have a weak
simple
stick,
question.
you
How
reinforce
do you
with
know
other
it?
weak sticks.
Sorry, I'm just asking you. How do you know it's not true? People watching this are going to ask that question. I need to ask it to you. How do you know it's not true?
amaBhungane did not provide any concrete evidence
simply
besides self-confirming stories that backed up that piece,
It is
published in Daily Maverick, published in other independent in their network as in an effort to reinforce.
Okay.
And all of these
I'd like to
organizations,
know
by the
somebody's
way,
in
are
addition-
reinforced.
so tell me what wasn't true.
Well, what isn't true? Yeah.
Well, show me
Tell
what
me
the
what
evidence,
wasn't
Show
true.
me what the evidence was in the piece initially published by Mika Reddy
No,
and
no.
Sam Salt. There is no evidence.
Well, there's a lot of evidence there, and they, in fact, they also publish
a very
a
low
document
standard
file
for evidence.
with background evidence on their website. Now they're a credible bunch who are known for their thorough investigations.
Which is
But
why
you
I'm so
haven't pointed
disappointed in
to
this piece,
Okay.
because
So
of the
actual
actual
facts
credibility.
that was wrong.
I appreciate that. I want to just move on if I may. Can I ask you though, Anton, just because I'm also interested, I wanted to particularly interested in the way in which this piece attacked, and it's perfectly, with freedom of speech, you're entitled to do that. That's what I'm asking, is to what extent they're suggesting that there's a particular perspective that is trotted out by these newspapers, that there seems to be, and part of it is that a greater attack on black implicated persons than white, as I understand the piece, that's what you've said, that effectively there's a particular perspective that essentially supports, let's say, a Western view of the world rather than an Eastern view of the world, and that South Africans are entitled to a more cosmopolitan, as it were, propagation of news. I don't know how you respond to that. I'd be interested.
Look, I think they do point to a broad problem, which is that our media is not as diverse as we would like it to be. And the closure of New Frame is a sad moment because it decreases the diversity. It was a different voice in our media setup. But I think if you look at what they produce, and I think you can only really show such bias by analyzing the actual stories.
Well, that's
they
exactly what
produce.
I wasn't to happen.
I think you'll find, yes, and the evidence, and I think it's an oversimplification. Yes, by and large, a publication like News 24 has a perspective that I think you could describe as liberal. I think that's true. I don't think you could say it of amaBhungane, because really they're an investigative unit and they just don't publish that much of that kind of political material. Daily Maverick publishes quite a range of material.
Not true.
So it's
Why
difficult to
would
put
you not
them
be able
into
to
too
write for them?
narrow a slot.
Well, first of all,
you tried?
when you speak about
Have you tried?
when you speak about the Daily Maverick, you have to understand that the only people who are allowed to write on geopolitical matters are hawks like Peter Fabricius and Greg Mills, who was the advisor to the
But could I ask
four-star
you-
general
but a
who
blunt question,
occupied
I'm
Afghanistan
asking
in
this question.
2006.
I
So
understand.
their
I'm
particular
understanding,
worldview-
Roscoe, but I'm asking a simple question to which I do not know the answer, which is a dangerous thing for an
thing that
interviewer.
we-
Have you ever written anything for them or offered anything for them?
I'm not interested in writing for.
Why not?
I'm not interested in writing for them.
But then-
because they
but there
are
are others who do.
because they are right wing in terms of geopolitics.
Well,
now, as soon as you
when
have
you
a
say
situation
right-wing, let's
where,
just
and
test-
they're not transparent,
but let's
Judge,
test
they
that.
are not
All
transparent
right,
at
but
all.
let's test. Sorry, Anton, yeah.
Well, Dennis, I'll tell you something interesting. The editor of Daily Maverick told me today that the piece we're referring to was in fact offered to them to publish. But Branko showed me the exchange of WhatsApps in which he pointed out that there were a number of factual problems and errors in the story, some of which I've talked about tonight. And it's quite interesting that they went on to publish it knowing that there was a challenge to their facts.
That's not an accurate representation of the WhatsApp exchanges at all, in fact. So we offered it to Daily
Well, I'm
Maverick
sure we could
because of the fact that we named them. They didn't want to publish. That's fine.
Well, would
but
it be fair?
When
Would it be
if
fair?
we're talking about
would
Branko
it be-
Burkic and
but
excuse me,
would it
Judge,
be
if I
fair-
may.
No. I want to ask you a question. Would it be fair to say that an editor is entitled to say there are inaccuracies? I'd like to engage with you on them.
That is fair enough. And, the standard that we're aiming for, let me be clear, is not objectivity. That is a very hard standard
Good.
to
So
reach.
we accept
but,
that. Yes.
But the standard that we're looking for is fairness. So I'm asking you and the professor, is it fair that when an editor like Branko Burkic, when he wants to suppress a piece, he reaches out to the writer of a piece through her ex-husband and says, you must shut up. And then issue a very chilling warning to say,
I'm very anxious not to get involved in ad hominem parts of this. This program is devoted to principle, and so far, thank goodness, we've been dealing with that. Could I just ask you this by way of conclusion? When you write, for example, about, people being anti-Chinese and that, attacking Chinese colonialism in Africa, are you seriously suggesting that the Chinese don't have that as an enterprise? I'm not suggesting the Americans don't, but are you really suggesting that the Chinese are utterly innocent in their intrusions into Africa?
The National Endowment for Democracy has been going since 1986 because the CIA could no longer
I'm
accept
asking
the
you a
optics
simple question, your
of
view, not
interfering.
them. What do you say? Are you seriously suggesting that? Because you attack them on that basis. I'm intrigued as to whether you think that either Russia or China are splendid kinds of democracies of the kind that we should emulate.
I'm not saying that at all.
Good.
What I am saying
Yes, what do you say?
is that in terms of the hegemonic power of the West, the US, for example, has 30 military bases in Africa. The Chinese have one.
Well,
So-
but what I'm asking is, I'm not asking whether the Americans are particularly splendid people. It's pretty obvious that they're not. You only have to look at Mr. Trump to realize where they're going. But I'm particularly interested. You seem to over-egg the pudding on the other side.
I don't understand.
What I mean is you seem to be sort of almost attack these publications because they're critical of China or Russia. That's
Judge,
an
we
extraordinary...
have to bear in mind that the first stone was cast by amaBhungane.
Okay, we go back to that. But I didn't want to go there. I was trying to talk about the content of newspapers. One final question to you, Anton. How do we improve the diversity? Because that is an important point.
It's a very important point, and I think that as a society, it's something we need to address. we're getting less and less diversity. Just think of the lack of diversity in languages in our media, certainly in the print or online media. And actually, an interesting thing is we would have far fewer publications if it wasn't for the funders being attacked tonight. Many of these important publications only exist because of the generosity of those philanthropists.
All right, okay.
So
we need more philanthropists who are going to sponsor.
So it's unfortunate to hear them.
You know, ironically, that gets back to his complaint, which is that somebody pulled the plug and that basically reduced diversity. Unfortunately, I've run out of time, which is a pity, because one could carry on. There have been so many issues discussed this evening. But at the end of the day, for me, there's a real central question here. If you have a democracy, you want freedom of expression. If you want freedom of expression, you want diversity of view. You want readers, you want all of you watching this program to be able to see and hear and think about a diversity of views and not just one particular orientation. And in fact, perhaps to be more blunt, if our constitution is to be successful, we've got to carve out a particular South African identity, a complaint of which, the absence of which, I've been complaining about for a long time. How do we actually achieve that in the media? Well, you'll have to judge for yourself. You can talk to us on Twitter at @judge_NCA. Good night.